Welcome back. So the thing about the calculate function we learned in the last video is that it's really just a vehicle for us to combine sophisticated custom measures and calculations with sophisticated custom filters which apply to those calculations. Now, one flavor of filtering, which is the one we explored in the last video, is to require that the values in a column of our data meet some logical criteria. We essentially apply our own filter that adds to, and potentially overrides if there's a conflict, any filters coming from our pivot table. So looking at this example from our last video, in the first column we have our standard revenue measure, and the only filter being applied to this revenue measure is the values in our rows area, which are region names. But if you look at the values from our loyalty club member revenue measure, they're consistently quite a bit smaller. And that is because in addition to the filter being applied by the pivot table, that being a different region name for each row of the pivot, our measure itself has another filter baked in, which says that the order must have been placed by a loyalty club member. So in this way, the method of filtering we learned in the last video adds or overrides filters. But another approach, which has its own set of applications, is to remove any filters being applied by a specific column or columns within our pivot table, without replacing those filters with any of our own. A measure defined in this way is immune, so to speak, to any filtering from any part of our pivot, rows, columns, filters, or slicers, involving a column or columns that we specify. And DAX's all function is the way that we accomplish this. So the all function is typically used within a calculate function as that second filter argument to specify a field or fields that should not be included in the filter context of that measure. Basically, it works like the filters we applied via calculate, but in the exact opposite direction. Instead of filtering our measure by a field, it instead removes all filters from a specific field, regardless of the layout of our pivot. So this can be a difficult concept to get your head around without seeing it in action, so let's dive right into an example to see how the all function works. So first up, I'll remove these existing measures from our pivot table and replace them with order count. And because at this point we've added quite a few measures, I'm actually going to change the layout of my pivot table field list to make it easier to find my measures. So I'll click this gear icon, and then I'll choose this Fields section and Areas section side by side option. And this gives me a little bit more room to view the fields and measures that I have available to add to my pivot. So first I'll remove revenue and LCM revenue, and then for my orders table, I'll add order count. Now next I want to define a brand new measure, which will basically be our order count measure, but immune to any filters applied to it by the region name column. So the goal is, no matter where we have region name in our pivot, whether it's the rows area, the columns area, or the filters area, that field will not be able to filter our order count measure. So let's see how this works. We'll first go to our Power Pivot tab, and then add a new measure. And since this pertains to orders, I'll drop it into our orders table, and I'll call it order count all regions because we're removing any filters applied by region. And now for our actual formula, I'll first type calculate, and then our expression or measure will just be our existing order count measure. And now here is where the all function comes in. Instead of specifying a filter on a field, we'll invoke the all function, and as you see, we're prompted to enter a table name or a column name, although to be precise, we should generally enter a column name. So the field that we don't want to be filtering our order count measure is region name. So at this point, we can close the parenthesis on our all function, and then our calculate function, and then we'll check our formula. And then since this is going to give us a count, we'll format it as a number, and then a whole number, and we'll use our thousands separator, and then click OK. Now, if you compare the numbers that you're seeing for every row of our pivot under our new measure to our grand total, I think you'll get some idea of what's going on here. Because we told this particular measure that we don't want any filters coming from our region field to apply to order count, and because our pivot table happens to be broken out by region, every row simply reflects the grand total. Because when, for example, in the first row of the pivot, our pivot table comes in and tries to filter that order count measure by region equals east, north, central, our all function rejects that filter harder than Dikembe Mutombo blocking a shot. Now, just to underline how this all function only applies specifically to the field that we fed it as an argument, let's swap in a different value in our rows area. Let's say states. So we'll go down to our states table and first get rid of region from our rows area, and then drag in states. And now you see that our order count all regions measure is returning the exact same thing as our standard order count measure, because what we told the all function was to remove any filters coming from the regions field only. So when we filter our pivot table by something else, the measure works just the same as the standard order count measure. Now, for this reason, when you're using an all filter in a calculate measure, you'll typically want to filter your pivot table in some way by the same field that you're excluding in your all function. Otherwise, it basically has no effect. But at this point, you might even be questioning the value of the effect that it had, which was basically just to reflect the grand total for every row in our pivot. And while that may not be terribly useful on its own, it can be useful when the output of that measure is used to build another measure. So to see that in action, let me put region back into our pivot. And now I'll create a new measure that divides our regular order count measure by our order count all regions measure that is immune to any filtering from the regions column. So back to our measures dialog box. I'll call this measure order count % of all regions. And now for our logic, I'll simply divide our order count measure by our order count all regions measure. And then I'll hit check formula. And then because we'll be dealing with a percentage, I'll format our measure appropriately and then click OK. And now hopefully you can see the value of this. Now we have a measure that breaks out the percentage of our overall order count per each region. Now, if you're a real pivot table wizard, you might be furrowing your brow and wondering why I didn't just use the show values as % of total feature in the pivot. And while yes, that would accomplish what we're doing here, keep in mind that because this logic is encapsulated in a measure, it's now portable, and I can drop it into any pivot table that contains region as a filter. But there's also something else we can do with this that show values as can't touch. So let's remove region from rows and then add in year. But then let's add a slicer so we can filter our pivot table by region. So up to our Pivot Table Analyze tab, I'll insert a slicer, and then I will select region name, and then drag this over to the side of our pivot. And then I will enable multi-value filtering on the slicer. And now watch carefully what happens when I deselect a few values in my slicer. Our standard order count measure changes to reflect the filtering that we're doing from the slicer. All the numbers in our first column are going down because we're filtering out certain regions. But because our order count all regions measure is immune to any filtering from that regions field, its numbers are unaffected. So in our third column, our order count % of all regions measure is effectively showing us the % of all of our orders coming from whatever regions we've selected in our slicer. So now I can rapidly view the % of our orders coming from any combination of the regions we do business in. If I want to know, say, what percent of all of our orders come from just the Mid-Atlantic and mountain regions, I can clear filters on our pivot and then deselect the ones I'm not interested in. And now we see, with just a few clicks, that just under 31% of our sales come from just those two regions. Giving your end users the ability to get to insights like this within a few clicks is really what business intelligence in Microsoft Excel is all about. All right. Up next, we're going to dive into a whole new class of DAX functions, which give us an unprecedented ability to apply business intelligence to data with a date or time component. I'll see you then.